So today we're going to build upon the work we did in the previous exercises, in the previous trainings. We're going to go into building frames now, frames around focusing our attention in particular ways that's going to bring about the changes that we're looking for. And, we started off with a huge frame, like that reality could possibly be just a simulation. And within that frame, pretty much anything is possible. This class I'm kind of excited about. It's been rolling around in my mind for quite a while to get this concept out. And this one, we're going to start to create some frameworks which are going to condense down the infinite abundance that's available to us and bring about some changes in a more of a supernatural sense, hopefully, if we do it right. And so just to set the frame for you to listen to this through, when I was training in all of this I was fully immersed in it and being measured under the EEG, the electroencephalograph, which measures brain waves and amplitudes of energy. It came with a lead up into it, and that was that, there's this thing called a bell curve, and you have 0. It looks like this, basically. Everyone's probably seen this bell curve, and I'll put a link in later to give you an example. But in the middle is, normal, and then one level, 2 levels, and 3, which is the bottom of the curve. They're called standard deviations outside of normal. And once you get outside of 3 levels, 3 standard deviations, either positive, in the positive or the negative, outside of normal, you're pretty much classed as supernatural in the context of changing your energy and your brainwave states. And so it doesn't really take a lot scientifically to become supernatural. But, how supernatural do you want to go? Right? That's the question. So to set some frames really wide and to give you plenty of room to move and create in, I'm going to bring up an example and paint a frame for you in the mind that is really topical at the moment. So this week I'm watching Disney Plus, and the new MCU movie edition is released, Wakanda Forever, and there's this new character that's being introduced into the MCU. His name is Namor, or the Submariner, or Kukulkan, which is associated to, some characters in the gods in history, Mayan history. There's a nice little link there, but basically this character, it was the first ever Marvel character. He wasn't actually, it was before they actually started making comic books. As far as the research goes that I've had a look at, he first appeared in a pamphlet at a movie theater before the comics. It was an 8-page pamphlet or something that they rolled out into a comic book series later. So the Submariner, who I remember seeing cartoons of as a kid, but really didn't understand the concepts of who he was and what he was all about and what powers and abilities he had and how he got them. We're going to use this character as the frame to start getting our mind in a place where we can plausibly start to accept that these changes into the supernatural could be a probability. And so there's a few things, just quickly go over what this character's abilities were, and then we can, go into a bit more depth of, how to get our mind into a state to be able to sort of start moving in directions similar to this. Is that the character had wings on his heels, like the god Mercury, I think it is, the Greek god Mercury. He's able to fly. He's able to swim very fast. He has superhuman strength, and his skin is pretty much impervious to any kind of attack, like bullets and things like that, or very strong anyway. And he was actually the first mutant in the MCU universe. And so, we have the Marvel characters, which is also linked to X-Men in the mythology. Now, the thing I like about these stories, and I think they're all really based on the old gods, the Greek gods, the mythological gods, the Mayan gods, and stories of that go back to Atlantis and Lemuria. This character is actually supposed to be like the king of Atlantis. So the frames are pretty bloody huge, and he's supposed to be like immortal as well. So, and in the series that we see coming out now with Wakanda Forever, goes back, when he comes in this particular storyline, he's about 500 years old. So there's a lot of time for this character to grow and develop and refine, and for his genetic abilities to manifest. Now, before we go into all that and try and push our mind out into this realm of acceptance of things that we're taught are impossible, I want to just quickly talk about another film. And I use films as illustrations because if you want to go deeper in and get a story, and the mind, I know, loves stories, you can always go to these references and these scenes that I'm talking about in these films and get a better understanding of what I'm talking about. Because, to get everyone moving forward, I've kind of got to touch on a lot of these different subjects and topics and skip across a lot of ground pretty quickly to give you the program, the frame, right? So you can start working with it and playing with it. And the backup to all this is, and to go deeper, is, these movie references that I use to give you better illustrations. Because previously throughout history, for the time when they're trying to convey these ideas, religion was pretty much all there was, and the vocabulary and the understanding of the social consciousness back then was very limited. Most people didn't even know how to read. There wasn't technology like computers and the internet back then. So it was very hard to convey these deeper concepts, especially if you weren't privy to the mystery schools at the time and the knowledge of the libraries there. And so coming back to this other movie reference, the movie is called Gattaca, and it stars Ethan Hawke, a very young Ethan Hawke. And the story is basically set in a world where genetic editing is mainstream, and parents can start to genetically enhance their children in utero. So when they're born and they start to grow up, they grow up in, physically at least, with either physically superior or, particular attributes that lean towards certain abilities. For example, one of the examples in there was a piano player who had 6 fingers on each hand. And so he was able to play music that people with only 5 fingers couldn't play, for example. And there were all these little tweaks to the biological bioenergetic system, the body, that would enable people to be better suited to particular tasks. And this character, played by Ethan Hawke, his dream was to become an astronaut, and not an astronaut in what we see today, where you wear, an atmosphere pressure suit and you go in these tiny little capsules. This was like way into the future, where you'd get on board the space shuttle like it was an airliner, and you could, they would wear business suits onto the airline, and he was going to be a pilot to, I think it was the rings of one of the moons around the rings of Saturn in the story, which had never been done before inside that world. So he was not only, trying to become one of the, top 1% of the population in terms of the job and how good you have to be to get that job, but he was also wanting to be one of the first ever astronauts to get there, to a new location. And so he was what they call in the story a god birth, which means he had no genetic editing whatsoever, and the world had been in that mode for quite a while. And so what they would do is they would do a reading on his medical, do a medical scan, and because he had potential for defects like a heart attack, and his lifespan was only expected to be into his 30s or something in the story, I think. He was a little bit shorter than most people. So automatically he was just excluded from all these positions. There was no way he could become an astronaut just based on his genetics alone. And so in the story, he had to undergo this process, which is called a borrowed ladder. So someone who does have the genetics, he would impersonate them, and if he could live up to the expectations of someone with the genes in that role, then he could blend into that personality and he could become that person, right? And so there was a whole like black market to all this, and people would, sell their identities they were called invalids, right? It wasn't racism, it was genoism. And so so one of the processes, because he was too short compared to the guy who he was borrowing the identity from, who had the genes that he needed to get into the space program to become an astronaut, was he needed to be taller. So he had this, really horrific operation where they lifted his legs, they extended his legs, and so he's lying, in part of the story, he's lying on his back still, almost meditating for months while his legs reset to the new height. And at least physically he looked the part, and he could blend in. And then it was up to him, through his will and determination, to be able to live the role, right? So it's kind of a bit like, in Fight Club, how the guy just takes on the character and runs with it. Had to really get into it and live it out. And so we'll leave that there for the moment, because that's gonna be part of the foundation of this new frame. Coming back to the character Namor, who was the Submariner, like little things in my research on this character, because I didn't know much about it, came up that I'm not sure if anyone else has made these connections, but one of the ways that he was able to, his skin was able to become impenetrable to, say, things like bullets, which we consider a superpower, obviously. is that because he was so old and because he had spent so much time under the water amongst the immense pressure of the ocean, his genetics were turned on in a way that made his body stronger to withstand the pressure of the ocean at depths, right? And they said, I think one of the lines was that because he'd spent so much time exploring the unknown, he was able to deal with the massive pressures in the unknown, and that made his body stronger. And so when I think of the unknown, I think of, through meditation and altered states of consciousness, going into the void, going to the spiritual astral plane, for example, and beyond in all these different frequencies. And you need to be able to withstand the pressures of those frequencies. Also, the idea of water being the environment. Well, in esoteric circles, we all know that water represents the unconscious. And when we're talking about, him being the ruler of Atlantis and going deep into the ocean, we're talking about going into deep, deep states of consciousness, well beyond the normal levels of most people. The other thing, the wings on the heels and being able to swim quickly and fly is also probably a metaphor for the agility of the mind to be able to move around in those dreamlike lucid states, to be able to have the ability to move through space and time. So, when we think about this in terms of our lifespan, that kind of seems impossible. But when you factor in the idea that this character, which is a framework for us to be able to put our mind into and to imagine what it would be like to be a character like that, or in a world like that is removed from ours, that is much, much older, had much more time to adapt and evolve and advance than the surface world, right? Again, another metaphor for the conscious mind being on the surface world, and the unconscious being, below the surface in the depths of the abyss, right? The void. And so combining with this frame, we're going to also add in a lot of research that was done by Bruce Lipton, and he talks about epigenetics. All right, so just like in Gattaca, we had the character who did not have the genetics and needed to borrow the identity of someone with the genetics. He still had to go through all the training as though someone who had superior genetics would, and show up and still fulfill those tasks, which would presupposes a massive focus and will and concentration and discipline. And by putting himself through these challenges, let's say, the body is forced to adapt. And within the frame that he's borrowing, there's no level from the external reality, because they all see him as this borrowed ladder identity who's genetically superior and more intelligent than most people, born with these genetics. As long as he can meet the marks of appearing like that, then no one's going to be any of the wiser, and his body will start to assume the role, right? And so Bruce Lipton would say that genes aren't fixed. They're like switches, and gene sequences, just because you're born with these genes, doesn't mean through putting yourself through different thoughts, emotions, and experiences, taking different actions, you can actually resequence these genes. You can turn them on and off. You can induce new states of being, which has a physical effect on the body. So now we start to see that, we've got two characters here. One, someone who is not genetically equipped according to society to do this particular role as astronaut, right? And so he has to sort of go against convention and use his mind over matter and heart, the strength of will to get through. And then you've got this other character, Namor, the submariner, who, as far as the stories go that I could find, in the modern story in Wakanda Forever, he was a mutant because his mother imbibed a plant medicine which was grown out of what we assume is vibranium. So as he was in utero, the changes that happened to in the mother's consciousness and physiology were passed through to him, and he came out as a mutant, right, with all these special abilities, supernatural abilities, way outside of the supernatural bell curve, right? Standard deviations way outside. And so the frames are there for the potential for all this change. One is, coming from a place of not having the equipment and still doing it anyway, and the other from being born with the equipment and then going into environments where those genes were the genetic propensity was unfolded. Okay, so combine all this with what we talked about the other day, which was the hypnotized Superman theory, which is maybe, Kal-El wasn't really an alien at all. Maybe he was just hypnotized as a baby to believe that he had this frame where the triggers in the environment would induce supernatural abilities, and he could go beyond his genetic propensity, which Bruce Lipton would call being epigenetic, going above your genetics, your genetic sequencing. When you've got all these frames to work with, it gives you, and we go all the way back to the simulation theory where everything is just potential. You're coming from a place of pure potentiality, which is totally abundant with no limitations. Now we have these characters and ideas medically from Bruce Lipton to draw from, and now we can start to whittle down, from not being this awareness in a black void of space without any stars with endless time, to now we're inside a very large time frame. We're not limited by our genetic propensity, which is what we've been, in the past, at least, back in my grandparents' era, my parents' era, is that you're born with it. That's it. You've got to deal with it. Now we have new information that says that it's fluid. It's like neuroplasticity. It can actually change the mind and the physiology of the brain, and that can lead to all sorts of new adaptations. So when you combine all this, you have new limits placed on the absolute potential abundance, but now we're able to use those limits not as, a boot on the throat or a shackle keeping us down or suppressed, or a government that is trying to keep secrets from us and all that stuff, conspiracy theory. what we're doing now is we're using these limitations to propel us towards more open states of being, more useful, more interesting, more of what we are beyond the body. Okay, so the body now starts to follow the mind through the different timelines and spaces. And instead of just being locked into one bandwidth, say this ring in the middle, now we have larger rings with more potentials to access. Okay, so the other thing, we talk about Namor's immortality, right? Immortality is a great frame because it gives you plenty of time to make these adaptations. You can, within the framework of, what it would be like if you had the ability of immortality. Some people say, "Oh, I wouldn't want to live forever. That'd be terrible." And it's like, yeah, okay. If I get that. It could just, your body could turn into this prison sort of thing. Like, I'm just here and having to, no matter how good or bad it gets, it's just I got to deal with this and that's it, right? But why were the vampire stories so popular, apart from all the debauchery and hedonism and all that sort of stuff? I think part of it was it put the mind in a place of like, what if I had hundreds of years to develop all these skills, right? Or put my mind into all these new places? What could I achieve with all that time? And so it's a useful frame to also throw into the mix. And people are like, yeah, that's ridiculous. No one can live forever and da da da. Well, how do you know? Like, I'm sure if there were immortals walking around among us, like in Highlander, they wouldn't be using the same name they came out into this world with. And they'd probably be keeping a very low profile so they wouldn't get found out and all that sort of stuff. And there's all sorts of amazing theories about celebrities being that way and da da da. Believe it or not, doesn't matter. These are just more information to throw into the mix to help the mind grab onto something that's in the vicinity of the frame we're working with. And so if you really want to get into the technicality of stuff, I think I put up some videos a while back and they're online of, actually people are really looking into this and being able to turn the aging gene off and actually resequence the genes that are responsible for aging and reduce, what are they calling? Regress the age back to a physiological age of whatever you choose. Like, you could be physically a 22-year-old young man with the mind of someone who's much, much older and wiser. And for a woman, you fill in the blanks. So this is all useful information to go into the frame, right? The framework of going, well, what happens if I start to lean outside of my genetic propensity, my makeup, what I'm born with? What happens when I start to lean outside of the bell curve of normal to supernatural? What happens when I get out here outside the third standard deviations and beyond? What happens if I start to believe that maybe I'm not going to be immortal, but the world on a social consciousness level is already accepting the fact that our life expectancy is going to be much more than our previous generation was? And people say that, that's because of, healthy living and better eating and more information about great lifestyle. And yes, that is. But maybe that has nothing to do with any of it. And maybe they are just placebos to be able to get the mind moving into a space and a direction where it's like, if I do this, I'm going to live longer. So you do this and the body accepts that because you're doing this, you're going to live longer, and that changes the genetic sequences in your physiology, right? And so the other thing that I thought was really interesting with this Namor character was that his skin was impenetrable because to bullets, for example, or he's very strong. Like, he didn't need armor. His skin was super strong because he'd spent so long underwater in the pressures of the ocean that his body had adapted, right? And so when he came to the surface, he appeared to be superhuman in terms of his skin being impenetrable. Now, that's not a big jump when you think about it, in terms of physics, because we're on the cusp now of being able to go into become an interplanetary species, and Mars is the next planet, and the gravity is going to be different there. And for people who have only ever grown up on Mars, and there will be in the future, when they come to Earth, they're going to have a hard time because the gravity is different. It's going to be like walking around with an extra 20, 30, 50 kilos on your body, right? Everywhere. The pressure of the atmosphere, the environment. And so obviously someone in that situation in the future could come to Earth from Mars, having been born there, and if they spent enough time on Earth, they would eventually adapt to the pressures of the gravity here, just like we all have. And the reverse is true. If we ended up going to another environment where the gravity was heavier, and we were able to survive long enough to adapt, then when we came back to Earth, we would be super strong. And that's not a hard jump to accept, because if you look at it, bodybuilders, who spend their time pushing and lifting and moving massive weights around, their body adapts, right? Their body adapts, and if they're doing it naturally, it takes longer, and if they're doing it through enhancements and what are they called, supplementing, right, then it's going to happen a lot faster, right? So when you start to stack everything in your favor, you start to get these changes. But the ultimate factor here, where you get the most leverage, is by having a mind that can contain and accept the changes that we're going to give it, right, or ask it to do. So I mentioned this AI chatbot, ChatGPT, the other day, and if you just use it, like a chatbot, it's going to give you chatbot answers, sort of thing. But if you look into it, there's all these videos coming out, like in the first week it was released, on how you can prompt it in ways where it will, maybe bypass or bend the rules, or it'll go well beyond its programmed limitations, and it'll give you all sorts of different answers. So that's kind of like what we're doing with our mind here. We're going around the conscious mind, which is conditioned, it's conditioned in a way to sort of be small and not believe in certain things, not accept certain potentials. It's limited in this smaller sphere here, so this ring inside. And inside that is all you can access is what's inside there. And we're pushing the frame right out as far as we can go. And we're making trails, connections all the way through here that start in the frame of mind, or they maybe they don't start in the frame of mind, but they connect all the way back to things being plausible, at least, Like, we can accept that it might be possible from that point of view. And so now the ball's rolling. Now we're off to the races. Now from there, we can start to make these little baby steps. So, for example, how this would look in terms of wanting to have, impervious skin, right? And superhuman strength is that, the character Namor, the Submariner, wouldn't have, in the story, at least in the frame of Wakanda Forever, he wouldn't have gone straight down to, the deepest part of the ocean where theoretically Atlantis was. He would have, moved over a long period of time, deeper and deeper and deeper, as much as he could, as often as he could, without hurting himself, just like a weightlifter would, train and lift weights and grow their muscles and hopefully not get injured along the way. Or if they did, they would learn and they would adjust accordingly so they could keep progressing, right, and go deeper and deeper into whatever they were doing. And, I had this theory that at least, although it's, we see this spiritual world, this level, this fifth dimensional reality as being unlimited, there must be, because it still lands in the physical world, there must be some kind of rules, at least scales, like the rings here, where once you reach a certain level, you may not be infinitely impervious to everything, but you're so far beyond the current realm of acceptance that you at least appear to people inside this ring, for example, as though you're, infinitely strong, for example. It's well beyond anyone can accept in their mind, at least. So you're pretty much able to deal with most things, It's like a friend of mine back, when was it? 2014, 2015 or something, was getting into cybersecurity, and he got a job where he needed to do what's called a physical penetration test, where he would go into an actual company and not only try and access their computers, but any of the rooms that they had locked up and whatever, and he would find vulnerabilities. And he said, I've got to get past this card reader on a door, right, to get into the skiff and access their servers, and if I can. And in his mind, it's like these card readers were really difficult. But then upon a bit of research, he found that up until about 2010, most companies, a lot of companies didn't have that security anyway, but the ones that did have card readers, the technology kind of dropped off at about 2010, and no one really updated in the last 4 or 5 years, unless they were really, had a big budget and they took it seriously. So he found that not only if he could get into that room, then he probably could get into the majority, 90% of the rooms in all the companies in the city, in every city of the world. So it gives you an idea of once you reach a particular threshold, like there's the bell curve. Once you get past 3 standard deviations, you're considered supernatural. Once you get past 10, you're considered, class 5 or class whatever. And then once you get past, 100, there's even less people that can do that. Once you get past 200, there's even less people that can do that. And Once you get past 300, there's very few, if any, that can do that. And once you get past that, there's, hardly anyone in the world that we know of that is able to do that. And so within those frames, once you get that capacity expanded so far, let's say, once you have that capacity to accept new potentials, and your conscious mind is at least subdued, it's silent, it's quiet, it's not jumping up going, you can't do that, it's bullshit, and what makes you think you can, and you gotta be joking, all that sort of stuff. Once that's all silenced and it's actually paying attention and listening and learning, and it's going, well, I may not know how this works, but I understand and I accept there's enough examples out there throughout history, enough information on the internet, if I really search for it, if I piece it all together, that I can start to accept these potentials and I can actually take action towards them. And even if I never get there, right, even if I never get to the depths of the ocean of the Submariner, for example, and able to withstand the pressures of that, well, I'm probably going to end up as a really good diver at least, and I'm going to get to see a lot of really cool stuff in the ocean. I'm going to have a good time, right, for example. And I remember, I was at a stage where I realized I needed to take on a lot more information, a lot more quickly. And I worked out, it's like I need to be able to absorb more information and retain it and remember things. And the way I was reading at the time, it's not like everything's online and it's all video now. And, a lot of the research I did, for what I was looking for, at least, not there wasn't video, there's plenty of video, but what I was looking for, there wasn't much, video on, which is my preferred format. I had to do a lot more reading, and I had to do a lot of research and scrounging around and diving for it, trying to find this information was part of the process. It's a lot more accessible now. It's a lot more, you type it in, there's 1,000 people are doing videos on it because they've been researching, or people like myself have done the research, put it out there, and other people have done videos on it. And one of the skills I knew I needed to do was to read faster. So I looked up speed reading, and there was this guy who was the world champion speed reader. I don't even know how they do competitions for that, but apparently it was, and I think the video is still out there somewhere. And he said something really interesting. He said two things that are really interesting. One is, he'll say, well, do you just speed read everything? It's like, well, things, when I'm trying to learn something, I'll read really fast and I'll use the techniques that I teach to, absorb that information really quickly, like scanning words, sentences, paragraphs, pages, and gleaning through them. But if it's something like, and he was a Harry Potter fan, he said, but if it's something like the new Harry Potter book and I've been waiting for it for a long time, then I'm not going to speed read. I'm going to enjoy, reading it and immersing myself in the world and really taking in every word. And, it's like, he said, it's like eating a meal. You can, just because you can eat it fast doesn't mean you want to. He said, but the other interesting thing he said was that people think that the information is hidden, the conspiracy theories, they're hiding this from us, they're lying to us. And sure, there's a lot of misinformation, there's a lot of distractions, there's a lot of false trails out there for sure, right? There's a lot of people trying to lead you astray and when you're searching for something, they're trying to redirect you over to the toll booth here so they can clip the ticket and charge you as you go through, right? There's lots of that stuff. And there's bandits on the way that, want to rob you while you're on your journey and all that sort of stuff. So you need to protect yourself to certain degrees and be aware of what you're getting into and all that sort of stuff. But he said that the information, it's not hidden or restricted. He said it's all out there. All the information is all out there. It's just a matter of being able to find it, know what you're looking for, being able to find it, collect it all, and to make the links, and build the story and the picture that you're wanting to be involved in, right? It's all there. And I mentioned this in a video earlier, one of my older ones. I did some training under Joel Roberts, who was he doesn't like the term media coach, but he taught the language of impact. He taught how to package information linguistically in a way where the mind received it really easily and effortlessly. And he was brilliant at it, by the way. Like I say that he was like Yoda. He wielded a linguistic lightsaber, and he could make you pretty much think anything he wanted you to think about. He could paint pictures in a way that it was so easy to see, or it didn't take much effort on your behalf to see what he was trying to convey. It was almost like a form of telepathy. And so all this information's all already there, right? And he would say that the future will belong to those who master thematic linkage. And what he meant by that was, there's all this information seemingly unrelated. It seems to not have any reference to anything else. But, one of the spiritual principles is it's all one, it's all connected, right? You should be able to get from one point in one point to the other point, right? You don't necessarily have to do a straight line. You can move and come back, and, you can join the dots basically in whatever way you choose. And I thought that was really powerful. The future belongs to those who can master thematic linkage. And if you look at anything that's been achieved that was seemingly impossible before it wasn't, it was people who saw the bigger picture in a way that they could see the information that was out there and how it needed to be connected and correlated and compiled, and perhaps rewritten and repackaged in a way where it could become something else, and that could become the new norm, the new reality. And so this is this is where the rubber meets the road now. This is where we start to go, okay, we've gone beyond wanting to be unlimited. We went unlimited. We went all the way back to pure potentiality, where everything is just this, abstractness with no limits anywhere, no personality, no gender, no time, no space, no identity, no thing, right? And we were there and we dwelled there. And some people found peace there, and you can go back there whenever you like. And other people freaked out and wanted to jump straight back into their identity and their time and space and their reality. And that's fine, right? It's a bit like deep space without any stars, or it's like being diving in blue water, right? Or black water, deep ocean, nothing around you. And no light, and you don't know what's out there, sort of thing. It can be a bit daunting if you're not prepared for it. So once we went there, we come all the way back and we go, okay, let's create some limits. Let's create some boundaries that are going to not, curtail us, but they're going to focus us in a way where we can go way beyond our old self. We can get out of the mind that is actually creating the limits based on the frame that it's in, and we're going to push it out as far as we can, all the way to the edge. And even though we might be residing still where we began, now we've got all this to play with and all this to draw from. And, if you look throughout the stories throughout history, there was a group. Let me just bring this up. So, I'm not just making this up. Although I have a doctorate from MSU, make stuff up. They say you're only limited by your imagination, but if you want to go beyond what you've got, you need to expand your imagination, expand the limits of your imagination. Let's see if I'm... Yeah, so I'm looking up, I looked up the Cathars, or Catharism, Catharism from the ancient Greek katharoi, the pure ones, was a Christian dualist or Gnostic movement between the 12th and the 14th centuries, which thrived in southern Europe, particularly in northern Italy and southern France. Followers were described as Cathars and referred to themselves as good Christians. In modern times, they were mainly remembered for a prolonged period of religious persecution by the Catholic Church, which did not recognize their unorthodox Christianity. So I've just done a little bit deeper. This is just Wikipedia, but I've done a bit more research on the Cathars. And when we talk about Christianity, they're talking about the Christ consciousness. They were pursuing what the Christ consciousness, the manifestations of the Christ consciousness could be, not Christianity in the dogmatic terms of the Roman Catholic Church, which is why there was a problem, right? So Catharism emerged in Western Europe in the Languedoc region of southern France. I'm not sure if that probably pronounced that terribly. In the 11th century, adherents were sometimes referred to as Albigensians after the French city Albi, where the movement first took hold. Catharism was initially taught by ascetic leaders who set few guidelines, leading some Catharist practices and beliefs to vary by region over time. Where am I? I'm trying to get to the point that, yeah. Scanning. No, it's probably not going to... I don't think Wikipedia will go into it, but suppression. Yeah, there was a suppression of them. They were burnt at the stake. Interesting. A lot of them were burnt at the stake. And the reason for that if you go into, there was a massacre, they were massacred. Okay. Annihilation. Gee, these headings get better and better as you go down, scroll down. So the reason for this is because they're also labeled as Gnostics, right? Gnosticism is, what's the meaning of that? Because I think it was like, translates to the pursuit of truth or something like that from memory. Anyway, the point about the Cathars is that there were stories about them displaying superhuman abilities, right? Or perhaps they were mutants in terms of they were able to, through training, through focusing on the Christ consciousness, which is a whole different thing to the dogmatic religion, is that they were able to change themselves in a way, whether it was physically or just mentally or, energetically, to a point where they were able to display feats of, supernatural ability. Some of these were, superhuman strength, being impervious to blades. People could, go into fire and not be burned. They could imbibe poisons and not die. There were these interesting manifestations of whatever they were doing, and they weren't doing it like, it wasn't like, hey, look at me, I'm the strong man, or I'm the guy that can't be poisoned and stabbed. It was more like, from what I gather, it was like, because they had an understanding of being able to do these practices and overlay their consciousness onto reality rather than have reality compress them into a certain state of being. These were just kind of like party tricks, like, I can also do this, I can also do that. But what they were probably doing is like what we're talking about here, I imagine, because I wasn't there back in 1147, is that they were in a consciousness level where they weren't limited by the physical body. They weren't limited by things like space, time, what we would call in context of the other training sessions, the matrix, the simulation. They saw it for what it was, and they were using overrides and hacks and bypasses, kind of just like my friend, the IT security expert, who would, bypass a lock, right? Instead of, the mentality is from everyone else is that the lock is something that can't be overcome, right? Like, it stops a lot of people, just like beliefs do in reality, or mindsets, levels of consciousness. They keep people out of those levels, out of those rooms. But to people like, hopefully this group and people like the Cathars in their time, is they saw it as, these were just systems that were part of a greater whole. And like, even though the door has a lock on it, doesn't mean you can't get access to it if you know what you're doing. And so when you get past these certain barriers, then there's other things on the other side that you can gain access to or use or assimilate or make part of you that, to other people seem superhuman. Like I remember the way he would fly through websites and stuff, and I'm like, man, how do you do that? How do you even know what to look for? He said, I've been doing it since I was a kid. I remember he said my first hack was my parents' email or something like that. And so you build up to this over time. Yeah, because it's kind of like in the context of my friend again, the IT security guy, is that, we might look at a website or an access point, go, it's, you either got to have a password or you've got to, there's a paywall, you got to get, and you've got to be able to get the key and the code, or you got to pay your way through or whatever it is. Whereas he's just like, it's all connected. It's just, it's all accessible. It's just, do you have the skill and ability to get through there? In the case of my friend with that card reader, the door with the swipe card, he got this card reader and found that, it was really simple. It was actually simple to get to bypass that particular lock. And obviously they don't advertise that, just like a magician doesn't tell you how the tricks are done. But once it's like, well, every door is open to you now, even if it's got that lock on there. Some people can't get past, but for you, it's not a big deal. And so as we move into these different levels of consciousness, say this circle here is one boundary containment, one scale of consciousness. Here is the next one. The next one's here, and the next one's here. This can be associated to the energy centers, the chakras, the levels of consciousness, and how you view your reality from. The platform in which you see reality from dictates what's available to you inside it, right? So all this stuff helps you access greater levels of consciousness, greater scales. Within those new levels, and anyone who's ever been to a new level before, you're like, well, I'm going to have to be here a little while to assimilate, to see what's available to me, see what I can do with it. A bit like getting a new belt in jiu-jitsu or any martial art. You get there, it's like, oh fuck, now I've got to get to work and train all this stuff. But each time you get to these new scales, you might be trying to get to this level because it gives you access to the goal that you set out. Like that was your reason to expand your consciousness. But when you're there, you get access to everything that's within the band, right? So, for example, and this is something I would imagine, is when you get access to lucid dreaming, for example, when you know how to dream lucidly, things like having supernatural abilities in your dreams, like flying or teleportation or telekinesis, or any of these things, manifesting objects out of thin air, moving, breathing underwater, being totally comfortable in space, without a suit, sort of thing. All those things in a lucid dream available to you because now you realize it's a dream and I can do whatever I like in here, within reason, obviously, within the limits of my own imagination and realm of acceptance. So, like I said, once you're going for this particular level, right, the reason why you get there, why you want to break through might not just give you access to what you're wanting. It'll give you access to everything that goes within the container of that scale of consciousness as well, which is really exciting because, you know, when I speak to people who have those breakthroughs and achieve their goal, it's not like they might do a little Toyota jump in a celebration, but it's pretty much immediately straight after they're looking around the room of that new reality and they're going, holy shit, look at all the stuff in here. Now, I didn't even know what that is yet, but it's there and I can play with it now. And I just started playing with this other thing and, you know, this is really exciting too. And now I'm thinking about going in this direction, this goal. And so it can be really fun and exciting. And when you add the concept that we had before of, you know, immortality, and we touched on quantum immortality, which is an interesting concept, which basically is, you know, moving from timeline to timeline to timeline indefinitely and spending more time moving between timelines, which means you're out of time, which means you cease to age in the space between times, and your energy attunes more to that absence of time than it does when you're in the timelines that has time. Then it can get really exciting because you've got plenty of time to develop new skills and abilities and to try everything out and to really thoroughly go through the levels before moving on to the next one and collect, like a video game, you collect all these skills and abilities and attributes and experience, and your ability tree begins to grow. And it's only going to equip you and prepare you for what's on the other end. You know, just like the submariner, you know, with all the pressure of the ocean, probably, you know, in my mind, the story would go something like, as he's growing up, you know, being a teenager and a young man, doing whatever you would do as at that age with those abilities. When it came to the time in the story of the movie where he has to defend his people, he's well and truly ready to rock and roll when it comes to battle, right? He's honed his skills over a long period of time, and, you know, he's at a level of mastery of all the things that he has available to him. You know, and that's where we want to be with all this. We want to take our time as though we had control of time completely. Speaking of time, we've gone over time again. So I'm going to wrap it up here. We're just going to cut it off. There's so much packed into this video. If you're anything like me and you like what I'm doing here, you know, you might rewatch this on the replay, whether it's the first time or multiple times that you're looking into this, and you might sit there with other tabs open and you might hear a word or a concept, or like I was talking about the Cathars, and you might look that up and go, actually, there isn't a lot of information on them, you know, that isn't kind of trying to be condensed into all the terrible things that happen to them. Like, there's not much about what they're actually about, you know, why they were so feared by the church and why they were actually burned at the stake, and like, well, what's actually going on there? And so you might have to do a bit of digging. And if you're like me, you like going on these wormholes and seeing where they go, because it leads to all sorts of other things. And just finally, I'll just wrap up. When I was teaching striking martial arts, and, you know, when Taekwondo was going ballistic, and that was our grading framework for what was the beginning of mixed martial arts, you know, back in the early 2000s, UFC 1, 2, and 3 kind of thing, before grappling was what it is today, and no one really understood it very well, at least not in the mainstream. It was all about striking and kicking and punching and blending those styles together. when we were teaching, I had this young student. He was probably about 14 or something. And I said to him, if you really want to get into martial arts, and not just Taekwondo, because that's what we were teaching them so they can get their belts and, have the confidence and all that to, all the things that are advertised, more confident, better ability to learn and coordination and all that. I said, if you really want to get into martial arts and, have it integrate into your life, become a martial artist, then you want to study all martial arts and everything that goes around that, the philosophy and the history and how it all came about, and told little stories about, I think Kung Fu Panda was out. It's like, how did the 5 animal styles, why? Do you know how that came about? And there's a story there, that the monks would imitate the animals near the monastery, spend a lot of time physically training because they realized their bodies were going into atrophy because they were spending so much time meditating in the astral plane. I was like, what's the astral plane? I said, oh, well, maybe you should look it up, And I said, start off with Taekwondo, read about, watch videos about it. When anything ever, interests you or piques your interest, have a notepad or another tab open, have as many tabs open as you need, and just research that next word, and then do the same process, rinse and repeat. Do it a few times until you feel like, you've had enough. And I said, next week, come back to me and we can talk about where you're at and what you found. And so, yeah, the next week he came back and he said, oh, have you ever heard of prana? I'm like, oh, yeah, prana, chi, ki, energy. I was like, wow, that was quick. It only took you a week to get to there. So you could see where his mind was already, as a young student. He didn't just want to learn how to fight. He wanted to learn the deeper truths that were under the surface. He wanted to learn more about the void and the subconscious and what all that was about and what was possible in there. So anyway, we'll leave it there. Thanks for watching. Thanks for your attention. I'll see you on the next video, and bye for now.